You're in Germany, one of the world's richest countries, and yet everywhere you turn, people are worried. Not just worried about normal things, but genuinely anxious about everything from climate change to artificial intelligence, from immigration to economic collapse. This isn't just coincidence. There's actually a name for this phenomenon, and once you understand it, you'll see Germany, and maybe even your own country, in a completely different light. It's called German Angst, and it's one of the most fascinating examples of how history literally rewires a nation's brain. The foundation of fear. Now, before we dive deep, let me ask you something. What do you think shapes how an entire population thinks? Is it their current circumstances, their media, their politicians? Actually, it's their ghosts. Germany has more historical trauma packed into the last 400 years than most nations experience in a millennium. We're talking about the 30 Years' War, where 1/3 of the German population literally died. Think about that for a second. 1 in 3 people gone. Then came the devastation of 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the division of East and West Germany, and the complex trauma of reunification. According to research published in the Journal of Social Issues, these aren't just historical footnotes, they're psychological imprints that get passed down through generations. Dr. Aleida Assmann, one of Germany's leading cultural memory researchers, has documented how collective trauma creates what she calls cultural memory. Essentially, entire populations inherit the emotional responses of their ancestors. This isn't mystical thinking, it's documented psychology. But here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike countries that build their national identity around victory stories, think America with its land of the free narrative, or France with its revolutionary triumph, Germany's identity is fundamentally built around loss and the desperate need to never repeat past mistakes. This creates something psychologists call hypervigilance, but on a national scale. The modern manifestation. Fast forward to 2025, and this historical anxiety isn't just sitting dormant in textbooks, it's alive, pulsing through German society like electricity through a wire. Here's what's fascinating. Germany has the 3rd largest economy in the world, incredibly strong social safety nets, and by most objective measures, life is pretty good there. Yet recent polling by the Aleida Institute shows that Germans are among the most anxious populations in Europe about the future. Why? Because German angst isn't really about present-day reality, it's about the terror of losing control, of chaos returning, of history repeating itself. Look at what's happening right now in Germany. The war in Ukraine. That's not just a distant conflict to Germans, it's their worst nightmare made manifest, instability creeping westward. Climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's an existential threat to the ordered, predictable world they've carefully constructed. And artificial intelligence? To a culture that's hypervigilant about losing control, AI represents the ultimate surrender of human agency. The upcoming federal elections have become a psychological pressure cooker. Political parties, especially the far-right AfD, have figured out exactly how to manipulate this anxiety. They're not really selling policies, they're selling the illusion of control to a population that's been historically traumatized by losing it. The paradox of paralysis. But here's where German angst creates a fascinating paradox, and this is crucial to understand. The very thing that's supposed to protect Germans, their extreme caution, their overregulation, their need to plan for every possible scenario, is actually making their fears come true. Think about it. Germany is falling behind in digitalization compared to other European countries. Why? Because every new technology gets buried under layers of regulation and committees and risk assessments. Their infrastructure is crumbling because major decisions get paralyzed by endless debate about potential consequences. Dr. Wolfgang Streeck from the Max Planck Institute has written extensively about how this politics of anxiety creates a kind of democratic paralysis. The fear of making the wrong decision leads to making no decisions at all. And this is where the rise of populist movements starts to make perfect psychological sense. When people are drowning in anxiety about complexity and uncertainty, they become desperate for simple answers. The AfD's anti-immigrant rhetoric isn't really about immigration, it's about offering the psychological comfort of having a clear, controllable enemy to blame for feelings of chaos and insecurity. The global mirror. Now, before you think this is just a German problem, ask yourself, do you recognize any of this in your own country? Because what's happening in Germany is actually a window into something much bigger. Collective anxiety, historical trauma shaping present-day behavior, the appeal of simple answers to complex problems. Sound familiar? Research from Harvard's Shorenstein Center suggests that many developed nations are experiencing their own versions of collective anxiety, triggered by similar factors: economic uncertainty, technological disruption, cultural change, and global instability. The difference is that Germany has a name for it and a historical context that makes it easier to understand. But whether you're watching political polarization in America, Brexit anxiety in the UK, or rising nationalism across Europe, you're seeing variations of the same psychological pattern. What's your country's version of German angst? What historical traumas or cultural fears are driving political decisions that might seem irrational on the surface? The path forward. So where does this leave us? Is German angst just a permanent feature of German psychology, doomed to repeat itself forever? Here's the thing about understanding psychological patterns. Awareness is the first step toward change. German psychologists and sociologists are increasingly studying and discussing this phenomenon. There's growing recognition that acknowledging these historical patterns doesn't mean being trapped by them. Some of the most innovative responses to climate change, some of the most thoughtful approaches to AI regulation, and some of the most nuanced discussions about immigration are happening in Germany precisely because this culture of caution, when channeled constructively, can lead to incredibly thorough and ethical decision-making. The question isn't whether German angst will disappear; it probably won't. The question is whether Germans can learn to channel that anxiety into productive action rather than paralyzing fear. The bigger questions. And that brings us to the questions that really matter, not just for Germany, but for all of us. How do we balance legitimate caution with necessary risk-taking? How do we honor historical lessons without being paralyzed by them? And most importantly, how do we recognize when our fears are protecting us versus when they're controlling us? Because here's the thing. Every culture has its version of German angst. Every nation carries psychological baggage from its past. The difference is whether we're conscious of it or whether it's controlling us from the shadows. So next time you see a news story about German politics, or European anxiety, or even political polarization in your own country, remember German angst. Remember that sometimes the most irrational seeming behavior is actually the most psychologically logical response to historical trauma. And ask yourself, what's your angst? What fears from your past, personal or cultural, might be shaping your present in ways you haven't fully recognized? Because understanding German angst isn't really about understanding Germany. It's about understanding how history lives in all of us, and how awareness of that fact might just be the key to making better decisions about our future.